Lies, and the Truth, a podcast devoted to the stories of people discovering biological family they didn't know about, digging for the truth, and learning who they really are. I'm Jody Klugman-Rabb, a licensed marriage and family therapist with my own DNA story.
And I'm Christina Bryan Fitzgibbons, a genetic and investigative genealogist.
Today's podcast is with Alesia and her new cousin, Janet. Another story of DNA discovery.
Oh boy.
And Alesia is a friend of mine from the DNA discovery group on Facebook. Same group as Catherine the Great.
Wow.
So a lot of people joining this group now. I think we're close to 7,000. Is that right?
It's actually closer to 6,200.
62. Oh, I'm ambitious then.
She's rounding down, Jody's rounding up.
Yeah. So welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. Thank you both for having Janet and myself on your podcast. We're just thrilled to be able to share a story that so many now in the United States are sharing, as we know from the NPE groups and all the media coverage that has been going on nonstop.
So take it away. Let's start with your story.
To start off with, as Jody knows, I had a lot of medical problems, and because of those medical problems, I ended up retiring as a registered nurse in 2012. After that, as I was recovering from a massive brain tumor that was removed, I had been diagnosed with a massive motor cortex brain tumor. And after several surgeries and rehab, one of the big things that my neurosurgeon said is that you really need to be using your brain more. And I started looking into genealogy, and as I was starting to put together my family genealogy puzzle, I realized this is a huge endeavor, and I was definitely using my brain. But as I was doing the research, and finally about 2013 or so, the ancestry sites, and maybe a little bit early, began to release the ability to do the DNA test, the swabs, and they were much more, they were cheaper really to take. So I took a test with a half-brother, and when the test results came back, it showed we were not at all related.
Oh yeah, and here's where the story gets real good.
Yeah. I had already began to, even way before that, I felt a little like we weren't related. I mean, there was this feeling that I couldn't put my finger on. We've talked about intuitions and so forth. I didn't fit in with my father's, who was my father, the father side of the family. They were lovely people, but I just didn't fit in. That led me as the time went on, and when I finally had time after retiring to explore more about my DNA. I didn't at the time when I asked him to do the DNA test with me think, oh God, I'm going to come up with like finally the answers. But when I finally got the answer, when the DNA test showed up on my computer in 2014, I was in shock. I was sitting at my table when I got the results in, and my head was just swirling because I knew what this meant. But it was still not enough. I was in this like, oh my God, I need to talk to my sister, who I shared a sister. I have a sister with my mom. There's two of us. My father had been married before he married my mom. So I had called my sister and asked her if she wouldn't mind doing the test. She didn't believe it. She says, there's no way. But there was just too many things that led me to know that this was the truth. When she did the test and my son, it showed that she was, and she's younger, 1 year younger than me, that she was related to our older half-brother, but I was not. My son did the test, and it showed he was related to my sister, but not my half-brother. And so this began the journey of now we needed to talk to my mother.
We need to talk to mom. Oh boy.
I needed to know, I needed to have that documentation in my head that, okay, before I speak to her and bring this up, I need to know I am 100% right about this.
Did you have a good relationship with your mom? What was, is she an open person? Or did it feel like there was a disconnect, or that she knew but that you didn't? Like, what was your sort of gut feeling going into it?
Well, actually, my mom and myself, we've had a wonderful, just a very loving relationship. In fact, really, she raised my sister and I. My father was aloof in some respects, even though he was there. He paid the bills and took care of us. But my mother was the one that raised us. I'm 56 years old, and it was just from that time frame in those days where the woman raised the kids and the father to work.
Right.
He was pretty quiet. So we had a very, very good relationship.
Right. Yeah.
I reached out to her. I was actually walking. I thought I was trying to think of the best way to talk to her. Like I needed to be moving. So I was out on a walk, had my headset on, and I called her. And I just said, Mom, I need to talk with you about some things. And she said, sure. So we spoke, and I said, I did a DNA test, and the results have shown some very interesting information that I really need your help with. And as I was speaking this, I could hear this like major silence on her end.
Yeah. Notable.
Right. She was just, she lives in the South. She's in Alabama. I live in Seattle, Washington.
Right.
So we're very far away from each other. But she says, I don't know what you're talking about. She denied it. She completely denied anything about it. Well, she hung up on me. And then I'm out walking. I'm like crying. I'm like, tears are just flowing from my eyes. I'm like, how do I deal with this? Well, within 10 minutes or so, she called me back.
That didn't take long.
No, she has a conscience. She's a really loving person.
Yeah.
She didn't want me to know about it. She called back and she goes, yes, there was a time in my life that I had an affair, and she said her marriage wasn't going well, and so she met somebody. It was a very short-term relationship over a couple of months. She left her. She was married to who was her husband, my sister's father, and she left him and went to where my father lived, and they had an affair for about anywhere from 2 to 3 months. She then said that she left him and went back to her husband. And after that time, she came back. It was the spring of 62. By the fall or September or October of 62, she starts throwing up, and she's back with her husband. She realized she's pregnant. So, and my mom she's a very stoic woman, and she's private too, very private. So, she's explaining to me that when she went back to her husband, they had made a pact with themselves, decided they would never tell anybody that this is going to be their baby and nobody else's. And that's the way it went. I mean, neither one of them, my stepdad is dead now. He died in 93. He took it to the grave. Only one time he said to me, he was on his deathbed actually, and he just said the weirdest thing to me. He goes, your mom is not who you think your mom is.
Ooh.
Wow.
I just thought, well, okay, his lung cancer had gone to his brain. Maybe he's just kind of out of his head.
Sure.
I just let it go, even though I felt like, because I'd had these weird feelings before that something was off. I let it go. I was actually 7 months pregnant with my first son, and I'm just trying to live my life. And at the time when he was dying, I just wanted him to be loving and wanted everything to be going the best we could make it go and not think about anything else. So after he passed away, and then my mother's telling me the story about, she thought for sure that, it could be his. So she said she blocked the affair out of her mind. She literally blocked it. She couldn't remember his name, nothing. She never remembered his last name.
Wow.
We hear this a lot.
Yeah, I bet. Well, from 2014 to 2017, I was on a search. It took over 3 years. There was nobody that had been dealing, at least I thought so, been dealing with any kind of these kind of. I thought it was alone on an island.
People still don't know you can do it, like that you can figure it out.
Yes, it was crazy. But what happened, my mom is actually from Berlin, Germany. She was born in Germany. She was a first time immigrant. So when my DNA relatives showed up on my ancestry.com site, they were all, in fact, I found out I was 52% Jewish. So they were all Jewish matches, but they were just fourth to sixth cousins. So
Right. Wow.
as more and more people were taking the tests, and my mother was still blocking out with her memory was like, it was just this unbelievable block of memory, but she could remember the street address of where we lived in 1964. I was born in 63, and I'm like why can you not remember this other man's name? So I just had to let it go. By 2017, I got a closer match. And I ended up talking with this woman in Rhode Island, and our stories were very similar, but we were a second to third cousin match. And it was then that I decided I'm going to look into the 23andMe. And I took that test, and that's when I got my aha moment. It was September of 2017, which is 2 years ago this month. And in between all this, I had three genealogists working my case. They ended up just becoming really very good friends with me because they really wanted to help me find my father, my biological father. One of the matches was, one of the ladies that was helping me, because I love doing genealogy work. She actually had found me through what was my maiden name. And we began a friendship. She lived in the town where my mother did remember where my dad lived in Kentucky, was in Kentucky. I got this very close match, and I went to her Facebook page. We became very good friends as she was helping me with the search. And it just so happened there was a rare match, and I'm not going to say the surname, but it was a rare Jewish name. And it ended up being that he was a rabbi. I ended up talking to him on the phone, and I was able to start putting some of it together. But my friend Nancy Shelton, who lives and she's fine with me using her name, by the way, she's ends up being a match to my sister, who's they're cousins, and we're actually cousins from the stepfather side now, even though we're not blood related. I go to her Facebook page, and I find that she's actually friends with the rabbi's family, a family member.
Mm-hmm. They're always closer than you think.
It freaked me out.
I'm telling you, it's crazy. I've seen that before.
Christina, it's completely crazy. And, as Jody knows it from us both going through this shocking discovery, we're almost like we're just on this major big hunt where we're so focused on trying to figure out what's going on. It almost like an obsession. At that point, I was within days of figuring it out.
If you think about it, you're like, well, how did they meet each other or know each other? There's had to be a connection even then. So sometimes you find out, oh, it was a neighbor, or it was your cousin's neighbor, or it was a school, or so then it makes sense that somebody was connected to the rabbi, because how else did they meet back then?
There's always a rabbi. Is this a good point for a rabbi and a priest walk into a bar joke, I think?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God.
All right.
Well, it's true that when I talked with him, he was a little shy of wanting to share too much information, even though he acknowledged that we were related. When I went to the Facebook page, just to jump back on that,
yeah,
this sister-in-law was a friend to my genealogist, who lived in the same city as my dad did. They all were in the same city. She reached out to that woman, and it got to the point where they were not really wanting to get to know me. There was a rejection pretty much from the closest family members. The rabbi, his mother, they just rejected me. They were my first cousins. And I actually, at that point, we began putting the pieces together, trying to figure out who my dad was.
And they started to put up the walls because they were starting to protect this person, or did they at that point know? Or
just to go back, there was a few phone calls we made and emails to each other. I was still trying to figure out who my dad was. She said so many different things that it confused me to really figuring out who my real father was. She said my real father was over 6 feet. She made these things up that made no sense. But when I called her and said, Mom, I'm getting very close to figuring out who my dad is, she started giving up certain things. Like she goes, I remember his name was Jim. And I said, well, was my dad tall, Mom? Was he really over 6 feet? Because my kids are 5'7" each. My ex-husband was 5'7". And she finally said, no, your dad actually was short, like 5'6", 5'7" at the most. And things started clicking. The person that had the Facebook friend of the relationship, she started looking at the genealogy and the census records. She only found one man in the family that could have basically been my father, and he was 30 something years older. Mom said he was maybe 10 years older.
This is why I almost never want to know the information from Mom, because it always throws me off for reasons like that. Sometimes it's intentional, and sometimes most of the time it's intentional. And
there's always a wrench.
Yep.
It will stick in my head. Like I would have had that 10 years stuck in my head. You just have to put it to the side and say, well, and you can ask Jody, I'm always like, well, that's what she said, but
yeah.
I know I'm always like, lies.
Yeah, Christina doesn't believe anyone. Nobody's telling the truth.
Mother had, as far as I was concerned, never told me a lie. So it was very, very difficult for me to understand why my mother would do this to me, put me in a position where I'm having to figure out who my real father is. I
Oh, yeah.
I was so sick on my stomach. I can't even begin to tell you. And of course, Jody understands what this feels like.
Total mind games.
Just couldn't understand, what was going on. I knew that there was something happening here. I found all these different, over a 3-year period before I really found my father. I had all these hints. I was the only left-handed person in the family, who I thought was my dad's side. When I finally found the family, I found several left-handed people. I actually, on a obituary of a cousin's, I found that, and I found out when one of my sons, I have an older son that's very disabled, has autism, and that one sister-in-law we found online, she has a daughter that looks a lot like my son, who's severely autistic.
Yeah.
You're looking for hints and clues, and you're trying to discover what is it that would put this family with your family. You're right there with the right people. But it wasn't until the gal that was in the same city that she called and talked to this woman, and we looked at the census records. We found this guy, 30 years older. I explained it to my mother. There was so much going on within that week. It was like a major detective story going on.
Right.
We went to the Facebook pages. She got the census records out. And then when she found who she thought was my dad, we started using newspapers.com also. We found him. He became an attorney in 1936 and worked into the 1950s. What ended up being the big problem with the close family was, and I still to this day don't know all of it, and I probably never will. My father was a very controversial man. He was extremely brilliant. He was smart. He ended up in Master Detective magazines, in hundreds of articles on newspapers.com. The sad part is my biological father, had some major issues in his life, and the family somewhat cut him off, the closer family. So I was trying to figure out, how am I going to learn more about my dad? My genealogy's friends, she started working through all the census records, figuring it out. And when she found him, it was through the newspapers and all these different things, these pictures. We started just putting together what looked like had to be him, because it ended up being that I only had, he was the only one that could be it.
Right.
I matched with the rabbi, who was a first cousin, but right above him, that my number one match was my nephew.
Got it.
And it was a new half brother. And so I ended up being able to call him when we started putting it all together.
Mm-hmm.
I just have to make this clear. I'd already figured it out with the genealogist that this man had to be my father. When
Right.
I approached the one cousin, the rabbi, they immediately cut me off for the most part.
I'm so sorry.
It doesn't make any sense. I mean, what is the purpose? I mean,
Well,
I know what her purpose was, like not dealing, but you know.
yeah. Think back to Alicia saying that he was a black sheep of some sort. He had something going on in his life that made them distance themselves from him.
Right.
So now having a new relative because of him was probably threatening. I wonder what it was that he did.
Well, you must have the articles and you must know.
Yes, I know quite a bit of his story now. I obviously there's more things that I don't know. He was for over 20 years a brilliant attorney. He had a problem with women. He was a philanderer. Um, and so I ended up calling, there were several of the second cousins that were amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up calling only one first cousin was left alive. My father was born in 1912. And I found one cousin, his first cousin, living in Chicago in assisted living.
Wow.
When I called him, he immediately told me the story. He said, my father, he basically said to me, and I've had no reason not to believe him. He said, my father was just a brilliant attorney, but had this dark side. He would get in trouble with women.
Oh.
What does get in trouble mean? I mean, aren't all men in trouble with women?
He was well known in the city. He was well known through New York and through Kentucky and through Florida, through all the East Coast side. This is the 1940s, 1950s. Um, I was told by this cousin that in the state he was living in that he was being groomed quite possibly to run for governor.
My.
He was a very strong personality, and there was people that just were his enemies. So, as according to this one first cousin, he said that there were people looking to to put him out, I guess. And I think the smoking gun was probably truthful because he had this problem with women. So what happened was he did some things. How should I put it? He wrote some wills wrong. So he made some mistakes in his own practice. So he made some mistakes in his practice, and then he was also involved with younger women.
Yeah.
Got it.
And at the same time, the system came after him, and he was at that point he got off on the situation with the women, but he was actually went to jail for a year because of
Oh, my.
writing bad wills.
Wow. Okay. It sounds like politics nowadays, to be honest. Hasn't changed much. Smoking gun, lots of women.
It really does. He would have made a great politician.
Of course.
It was crazy, and so I think because of that, my father was very wealthy. I'm sure he blew through all his money and had nothing left, and probably there's no telling what all happened. But just reading his stories, it really broke my heart because it was like I was listening to my dad's first cousin explain this to me, and then he said, if it wasn't for the women, your dad would have been the greatest of all time attorney in the state that he lived in the state of Kentucky. And I had to hear that. And it was just heart wrenching for me because this was my flesh and blood.
Right.
So there were two half brothers that I could call. Okay. This one particular half brother, we talked on the phone for 2 hours, and I said to him, I'm pretty sure we're related. We really had a very good conversation. He believed me. And I said, would you be willing to do the 23andMe test? And he said he would be. He also had a picture. He didn't have very many pictures of my dad because he himself, they lost all their pictures in what they said was a flood. All the pictures that my dad took, their basement flooded.
Oh, what a shame.
Anything I had were just newspaper articles and just a few pictures. There were a few pictures he had. of my father, but he had one on canvas and he said he could send me that, and he did. He took the 23andMe test. Now, let me explain to you. There were actually three half brothers, and I haven't talked about one of them. One of the half brothers is in Texas. He's an attorney. It's been incredible. This third half brother took the 23andMe test, and it floors me to tell you this. He was raised by my father, and he comes out, and he and I don't match.
Oh my God.
Oh boy.
We are now in a world where he's an NPE. He doesn't even know who his father is.
Oh, wow.
Oh, well, I've had one of those before. Oh boy.
It was crazy. I had a third half brother who I'm still waiting to have him do the DNA test.
Well, he may not want to now that he knows one of the other brothers found out he was an NPE.
This will be coming around, I hope, within the next month. But it's so crazy that your life, what you thought was just in a way a normal life, and now you're dealing with a parental identity discovery, as Jody likes to call it, or NPE, non-paternal event.
Right.
And it shakes you to your core. When you're starting to see the domino effect of people falling left and right, what are people like? How are they when it gets down to the nitty gritty of life? The personal stuff that we have to deal with personally. We have to figure out who we are. We have a mother we're not sure we can trust anymore. We're having family that hangs up on a new family. I have who I thought is my half brother. He finds out he's not my half brother. We're still talking. We're still friendly. The other half brother, in the meantime, decides he doesn't want to speak to me. So because I'm looking and searching, I'm feeling alone, and on this island, I'm start looking for second cousins, and I came across a number of wonderful second cousins, and that is where I feel like I finally began my healing process. Was these people were willing to listen to me and hear my story, and I actually my paternal side of my grandfather's side, I actually have a cousin here that's visiting with me in my hometown here in Seattle, and we have become very close. And if it wasn't for her and some of the other cousins, I would not be here. I would not. I'm not sure where I would be mentally on this journey.
Right. Well, it's such a up and down. It's just like you're sort of being volleyed back and forth, and it can change in a dime, really. You think, okay, I've learned this, and then, oh my gosh, and this, and then something happens, somebody decides not to talk. It's not always about the people who you find at the core, meaning mom or dad or brother or sister. You can really find a connection on that outer circle, which is really close in, but a second cousin or someone you share great grandparents with, you're very closely related to them. And I say to never discount those relationships, because many times, because they're not as close to sort of the heart of the gossip and the drama, it's much easier, and they end up being more receptive. You found your cousin, who you're going to introduce us to, your second cousin, and you're a perfect example of why even just going one step out, like it's not over just because dad hangs up or first cousin or brother hangs up. There's more to it.
I grew up in the same town where Alesia's biological father was born and raised and lived. And I knew him, but I knew him as a very young child. And there was a point in my life, I'm about 11 years older than Alesia is. And so there was a point in my parents early, they were very close to this cousin because he and my mother were first cousins. When Alesia reached out to me, which was about this time, the fall of 2017, my background is I'm a clinical social worker, and I've had a private practice in where I live now for many decades. But I retired from that practice about 10 years ago. But in the course of my clinical work, I had worked with some adoptees who, had struggled with the decision to search or to not search for their biological families. And so I had, some awareness of some of the things that are significant in this whole process. But what stood out to me was Alesia was so well prepared by the time she reached out to me. She had so much factual information. And so my role basically was, to affirm and confirm some of the information and, add a few anecdotal things.
I'm sure you did.
The juice and the gossip.
That was one of the difficult things because her sincerity, her openness, her preparedness, her, hunger to have this information was so evident in that first conversation that I felt so badly that I did have this information, though from the perspective of a child's memory about him, and I just felt so badly that I had to impart that and confirm that yes, he was considered a black sheep in the family, and there was this fallout in his professional career, and I wish it were different. I so wished it had been another cousin in the family. I wanted it to be different for her because she was just so open and sincere in telling me her story and her whole process.
Of course. Whenever somebody has gone to look and they've put in so much work and they've got so much writing on this emotionally because it's just been exhausting and you end up being the person with the information and you're like, oh gosh, this is wish I could have given you something with a prettier bow. It's a lot of pressure too. Like I've had that situation where I'm like, now if you had been the child of this cousin.
Although, even though you couldn't have given her, happier information about her dad, what you did give her was the gift of connecting with her. You were open and receptive to the vulnerability that she was living in. And I just heard her credit that connection with stabilizing her mental health around this.
And I will say, one of the other positive things, and I really, want to acknowledge this, is that given the other work and the other contacts that she has made with, I'll say, other third cousins, some of whom I've not been in touch with at all or very minimally over the years because I moved so far away. But that's been a nice added gift, if you will, to hear some of the things that she has shared about folks she's been in touch with. And I've actually made some contact with some of those folks more than, I would have if it hadn't been for Alesia. So that's been this added bonus, if you will, to hear updates of family members that I would not have reached out to or about.
Right. Or you're like, oh, I forgot about them. Well, I haven't talked to them in 45 years. It's kind of strange to. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I totally. Yeah, it's interesting how that can happen.
All of the family on the paternal side, just about every one of them are in very high, how should I put it, the professions that are time consuming. They're medical doctors, they're attorneys, and they're just their own big businesses. If I named the name of them, you would know it. But they're all very, very busy people. But what helped is, as Jody just mentioned, my own mental health, reaching out and making sure I had somebody to identify with, that I understood who I was, what I came from, that even though my father was who he was and had his issues, that there were other family members that I could begin to implement in my own life to become engaged with them, if you need a good word for that. And it meant so much to me that through my own personal journey, that these cousins, and they're all first or second cousins. They were the second cousins, especially, they really became my family. I've spoken to several of them now. We've talked about hopefully having a reunion at some point to get that all of us get together. But I want to bring up when I went to visit Janet in her hometown. She, when she was born, she's 11 years older than me. My father went to her home, her parents' home, to meet Janet when she was an infant. Janet's father was a professional photographer and loved videos and all that stuff back in the 1940s and 50s. He was videotaping my father holding Janet. I was with Janet for like 4 nights. We watched it the very last night I was there. I'm not sure why Janet waited to the last minute, but it was probably a good idea. When I saw my father holding her, I asked her several times, can you forward it, rewind it, fast forward, rewind it, fast forward? I couldn't get over watching my father, like taking his glasses off, putting them down, his mannerisms, the way he looked at her. It made me know that my dad was somebody that loved. And when I had been hearing before that from other people was this man that was not, just didn't all add up.
Well, must have humanized him.
Yes, it did, Jody. It really did.
It was very emotional obviously for both of us, because I sat there, and I had seen this before, but not from this perspective. And it was very sweet.
I can see how hard that was and how sweet that video must have seemed, but also so sad. Did you feel sad like that you never got that with him? Or were you just more elated that you were able to see that at all?
Well, the sadness sort of overcame me first. I really feel like I missed out on a lot of missed opportunities. To be able to have at least known him maybe in my young adult life. Maybe the father that raised me died in 1993. I don't understand why my mother wouldn't have told me the truth at that point, but she did not. And it was one of those things where how do you explain it? It's not right. It's not fair. It's not right, but that's the lot in life that I was given. And so I had to make the best of it, and I had to learn to be able to forgive my mother, and I have forgiven her. We're still dealing with some fallout with me sharing my story.
Yeah, that's a whole other topic.
Oh, I'm sure she doesn't like that.
It's the dynamics of having a parent alive, like my mom. A lot of the people that are we have a group at Jody, like we all talked about, private Facebook group that we go to, NPE. And that we also have a fellowship part of that too, which is the nonprofit I'm very much involved with. I'm the vice president of that. But we're working to let everybody speak out and say their piece, and we're learning from each other. The huge need for the psychiatric help of our community. And as I spoke recently about my genetic story, about some of my own health issues that were familiar in the family, I brought that out in a blog post I wrote, and my mother read it, and it opened up her wounds, and it upset her. She did not want me to share, and so I'm beginning to figure out that I'm learning about having to deal with boundaries with her, and making sure that I don't hurt her, but she understands that this is my story now. So we're dealing a lot with that kind of stuff with her. It makes it very interesting. You really just want to be able to share about, hey, this is my life now. This is who I am. This is my story to tell. And I don't want to when I share my story, because I am known in the NPE community, pretty much throughout the United States. I want to be able to be a positive influence to others that it's okay. It's okay to share your story, that you're not, just because you were given this lot in life, that this genetic storm hits you, that doesn't mean that you can't come out on the other end of the story in a positive way.
Very well said.
I think that the emotion, the overwhelming emotion of shame is such a painful and deeply rooted emotion to work through and beyond. And when you're talking about a generation of women who did not necessarily reach out to therapy, psychotherapy, and utilize that kind of support and input, it's a difficult thing to overcome. I agree with you that to reach out to that population and encourage and support and provide the resources to talk about this in a safe, supportive environment is so important.
Right. And even with just each other, even with the mothers just who are holding this just by themselves at first, just to see how really common it is.
Yeah, and that'll come out more and more. But I agree with the everybody's assessment here, and my 2 cents that I add will be kind of the traumatic piece of it, where because it's been experienced as a trauma of kind of survival for these moms, where if it comes out, my survival is jeopardized. My reputation is at stake, my relationships are at stake, and exactly what you said, Janet, about generationally, that perspective around a generation of women not only not seeking therapy, because at the time therapy was still pretty new and kind of a luxury. Frankly, it still is a luxury. They also had to deal with, if they weren't just as society expected them to be, then they had a very hard time surviving. And I think that's a big influence.
I think everything that you said, the religious aspect of things, the shame, my mother felt so ashamed. It has caused her, and she would not say this about herself, but it's almost as if she has a like PTSD now whenever I would bring it up. So I don't speak a lot about it, but because I'm more public and people have read my stories, I've been written up in a few articles and then on TV. It's become more prominent, but we need to give a good face to this. We need to tell people not to be afraid to tell their stories. And one I have to mention this. One of my cousins, one of the very first cousins I met, which is the second cousin to Janet too. When I saw this book and I came across her name, she's a professor at Northwestern, and she actually said that it was okay if I gave her name. Her name's Dr. Deborah Cohen. Uh, she wrote a book called Family Secrets. And before I even called her, I can't believe my own flesh and blood, my family is already thinking in their minds about these very issues because of their love for the mental health side of things. She's actually she's a history teacher up in Northwestern. But she talked with the people with Ancestry.com when she put this book together several years ago. It showed me a side of that there are people that do really get this. We're in it's a generation divide. I don't know if I will ever be able to help my mother enough to feel like she's forgiven. I don't know how to break that cycle.
It's not your cycle to break.
It's hers.
My heart breaks though, because she is my mom, and I want her to feel safe. And I also though know I need to tell my story to help others, and that because it's helped me. And my work now locally is we're looking at working with the donor conceived issues, the adoptees, the laws that are out there now, for NPEs to be able, if they want to change their birth certificate.
Of course.
The Parentage Act needs to be looked at, that was recently passed in 4 states. Have a lot of work left to do in this field. We're going to be, for this I think for the rest of my life, there's not a day I don't wake up thinking about what is it we can do positive to change the face of what is going on with the NPE.
You know what they say about family secrets? There aren't any, because somebody always knows or is going to know.
For both you, Alesia and Janet, I'm curious about your perspective on handling the known family as you disclose your story more publicly, because this is a problem I can definitely relate to personally as well. If I had kept all of this to myself, I would have no problem with my known family. But because I have chosen to be very open about it, it has created problems in that relationship. So I'm curious about your perspectives on how to navigate that. I think that we have lots of listeners that struggle with the same thing.
I was asked on more than one occasion, well, what does this person want from you? Because she was so well prepared and was so clear in that initial conversation, and also because of my own background, I realized that. It wasn't an issue for me. But I have found myself in the role of reassuring others that Alesia's a good person, and there isn't a hidden agenda here. And even if there was, there are ways that any of us can be mindful and practical. I mean, I don't give my social security number to a stranger over the phone. So, there are just some practical ways in which, we listen first before we respond. So, if, from my perspective, that's the only thing that came up.
When I spoke with family members, and I haven't even told all my family yet, but the ones that I've spoken to on my birth certificate, which was the man that my mother was married to, that side, they have been wonderful. They have said they'll always accept me as a part of the family. And I think I must be very fortunate with that, because some of the stories I have read have not been pretty for some people. I have felt like the best, I'm speaking for my own experiences, to be open, to not shy away from the truth. This is a generational thing, as we spoke about earlier. We need to be able to tell our stories. And now, as you just mentioned, I talked about my mom. And I'm trying to say, oh, okay, I need to help my mother. Or you guys said that it's her story, her deal that she has to deal with. It's the same with other people. If I'm telling my new people that I'm meeting in the family, and they don't accept me, how do I deal with that rejection or so forth? That's hard, but you have to learn. At some point, you let it go. At some point, you hang up the phone, and that's it. You talk to other people. Janet's been a great sounding board for me, where I will speak about, this is something that's happened. I'm very hurt by this. And she's brought me back to reality on a few things, to say, hey, you're going to run into this, and this is okay to have these feelings. And so I've learned as time went on. And as I said, I did the test back in 2014. I found the answers in 2017. I've had 2 good years now to really experience my new family. And I've actually stuck with the ones that really want to stick with me. And I've let go of the others. I know they're there. I hope one day that they'll reach back out to me, but I'm going to be okay if they do not. So I am building a whole brand new identity with, I'm still the same Alesia. I'm still the same person, but I'm learning so much about myself, the Jewish side of me.
Yeah, Mazel Tov, by the way.
Yes. We had you come out and speak at an event we had in Seattle, and you were just so well received. And we had such a great, successful event, and I'm so happy that we are making a change and making a difference.
Oh.
Every day, a new person's coming in to our private Facebook subgroups that Catherine St. Clair has started, and we're there now to help them when we should be. We should be there for them. So absolutely. We don't know when we might need to go back in that group. I don't write a lot in there. I don't post much, but I still know that if I needed to say something very important and something's happened, I can go in there and people will support me. I mean, it's an incredible thing to have that we have that private subgroup. It's very, very wonderful for all of us.
Well, to be there for each other, right? As a public entity now where I write blogs just like Alesia and I have a podcast, I'm not discussing it with them intentionally. They're reading and hearing about it without any personal impact from me. It's not face to face.
But it is upsetting to you that that is happening, right? And they haven't quite got it down yet. It's none of their business. There's people who are involved. I'm like, what the hell are you doing here? Well, who are you worried about finding out about this? You're really worried about the neighbor? Like, why do you care? Why do you think they care? Why do you care what the neighbor thinks? They're not in your position. They have no idea. They're not in the position of anybody who's really involved in the immediate circle. They just think that it's their business. And I think if more people were just be kind, just be nice, and know if know when it's your place and when it's not your place, and when to step back. It really just comes down to not being an asshole.
And those boundaries of not taking that stuff in is hard.
The people that do the best with this are the people with the best support system. Be honest if you can't deal. Be honest if you can. Like Janet's, like, she's open to it. There's somebody else who, they're not good at that kind of stuff. It just, again, I think if you can be kind about how you deliver these messages, it makes the whole situation, which is in everybody's family. Everybody's. If it hasn't hit somebody yet, it's about to. So...
You're right, Christine. And I just want to add one last thing here. My mother, after I wrote the last article I wrote on my blog, and I had many people read it, and I was writing mostly about my genetic and my medical hips problems. I didn't really talk about my mom, but my mother was upset, and then she reached out to my sister-in-law, one on the other side of the family, and my sister-in-law texted me, and she sent me a message, and she's okay about me sharing it. She goes, I can't even imagine finding out that, your dad was not really your dad. The deceit would be the worst part, I think. She's telling me, you don't have to answer to anyone about your life today. And I'm really proud of you for taking a stand. She mentioned too that when my mother called her, she explained that to my mother, and that her own mother had done the same thing with her brother. Like you said, Christina, this is all over the place. And back then, what was very taboo was sex outside of marriage, but it happened since the beginning of time. And I'm always going to love my mom, and she is my mother, and no matter what. And so she's elderly now too. So, and I love her, and I need to be gentle with her. And I understand that she may never get over the fact that I know about it now, but, I have to look at the sunny side of things in my life.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I need to keep a positive perspective. And of all the people, my main concern is my mom. And if she even listens to this, I want her to know that I love her. And no matter what, she's been there for me from the beginning. I'm afraid if I had been raised going back and forth to who was my real father, my life story would be so different than it is today. And I'm so grateful to my mom. I guess that's something I want to make sure you guys understand, even though she's acting kind of nutty.
I have empathy too. Like, what do you do? Like, if I was in her position, maybe I'd have done the same thing. There are people who have made much bigger mistakes. There are. Your mom doesn't need to feel like that this was just such a huge blemish on her life or her relationship with you, because it's not. She should be really proud that you have the guts to speak about it.
Right.
I think she's probably being a little too hard on herself.
Mm-hmm.
That was well said. I think that's a great place for us to end.
I'm so glad to hear your story, and with Such eloquence, it was told. And Janet, thank you so much for joining as well. Loved hearing your perspective.
Thank you both for providing this as another forum of support for so many people.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. We really enjoy it. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, guys.